The Jurassic began about 201 million years ago, on a planet that still bore the scars of the Great Crisis at the end of the Triassic. Before the legendary giants that now dominate our imagination existed, there was a brutal interval of reorganization. The Earth did not gift the world to the dinosaurs. First, it emptied competitors, tore apart entire ecosystems, and forced the remaining life to rebuild almost everything. The Jurassic world was still, for the most part, a colossal supercontinent. But this unified mass was already beginning to give way. Tectonic rifts, volcanic activity, and regional climate changes were slowly reshaping the planet's surface. The landscape appeared stable from a distance, but beneath it, geology was already working to separate lands, alter rainfall, reorganize coastlines, and change the fate of life. The fragmentation of Pangaea was not an instantaneous event, but a slow and powerful process. In rift regions, the crust stretched, opened basins, and created new ecological corridors. These geological changes influenced wind direction, rainfall distribution, and the formation of new environments. As the land changed, the entire chain of life changed with it, and the dinosaurs learned to occupy every niche. The lower Jurassic was, in many regions, a wetter, greener, and biologically expansive world than the extreme scenarios that marked parts of the end of the Triassic. Dense forests, floodplains, and large river systems provided food, shelter, and space. It was not yet the age of the greatest titans, but it was the time when the planet began to favor larger bodies, longer migratory routes, and more stable ecosystems. In the first millions of years of the Jurassic, many dinosaurs were still far from any image of absolute invincibility. They were efficient, alert, and opportunistic. But now, unlike the Triassic world, they found ecosystems less crowded by equivalent rivals. The real leap was not just in size. It was in ecological position. For the first time, extensive regions began to revolve around dinosaur lineages. Among the great winners of this new world were the ancestors and early representatives of the lineage that would produce the classic sauropods. Larger bodies, longer necks, efficient locomotion, and a digestive system capable of handling large volumes of vegetation gave these herbivores an extraordinary advantage. The Jurassic was beginning to reward size, and once size was favored, it would tend to grow almost inevitably. With the increase in size, herbivores began to physically influence the environment in deeper ways. Trails became permanent corridors. Banks collapsed. Vegetation was lowered over extensive areas. Footprints created small depressions that accumulated water and mud. Ecosystems were not only inhabited by these animals, they began to be sculpted by their passage. The dominance of dinosaurs became structural, not just numerical. Where herbivores expand, hunters respond. Early Jurassic theropods were not all colossal monsters yet, but their anatomy already indicated the direction of escalation. Quick jaws, sharp vision, limbs prepared for bursts of speed, and opportunistic behavior transformed them into central regulators of the new order. The Jurassic would not only be the age of growth, it would also be the age of refining pursuit and ambush. The early Jurassic hunt did not rely solely on brute strength. It required reading the terrain, calculating escape routes, choosing targets, and conserving energy. In a vast world, failure meant wasting precious resources. Therefore, natural selection rewarded not the spectacular attack, but efficiency. The brutality of the Jurassic was less theatrical than we think. It was cold, precise, and adapted to the cost of each movement. What makes the Jurassic so important is not just the presence of dinosaurs, but the scale at which they began to organize entire communities. Lakes, plains, and forests were no longer just backdrops where dinosaurs appeared. They were systems where their activity defined food flow, risk, movement, and competition. This was the moment when the planet began to look, for the first time, truly shaped by their rhythm. Territorial expansion is only lasting when reproduction accompanies ecological ambition. In many Jurassic environments, nesting areas began to be carefully selected, suitable soil, sufficient altitude to avoid sudden floods, proximity to food, and visibility to detect predators. The future of Jurassic empires was not only in the adults dominating the landscape,
but in the discrete nests where a larger generation was already being prepared. The climate of the Jurassic was not a passive backdrop. Seasonal regimes of rain, periodic floods, and regional changes in humidity determined where life could thrive and where it needed to migrate. For large herbivores, abundance depended on the stability of vegetation. For predators, it depended on the predictability of movements. Those who survived best were not just the strongest, but the ones most well-synchronized with the planet's cycles. The volcanic legacy of the Triassic-Jurassic transition continued to be inscribed in the relief. Basalts, rift basins, and newly formed terrains created mosaics of soil and drainage that were very different from each other. This variation helped to separate populations, diversify habits, and test new anatomical solutions. The Jurassic did not produce a single victorious dinosaur model. It produced many, each calibrated for a specific geography, climate, and pressure. On the continental edges, the meeting between land and sea created zones of extraordinary ecological richness. Currents, deltas, beaches, and prehistoric sandbanks functioned as interfaces for food and movement. Not all dinosaurs lived confined to the heart of the continent. Some explored coastal margins, taking advantage of vegetation, firm trails, and foraging opportunities. The Jurassic was, therefore, a world of vast and strategically diverse occupation. Even without modern polar caps, the Jurassic planet was not climatically uniform. At high latitudes, seasonal light shaped the behavior and productivity of environments. There were forests subjected to long periods of relative darkness, more pronounced cold, and their own ecological rhythms. This expanded the repertoire of the dinosaur domain. They were not just conquering warm plains. They were learning to occupy an entire planet in its variations. As bodies grew and routes consolidated, collective movement gained new importance. It was no longer just about walking in search of food. It was necessary to connect areas of food, water, reproduction, and relative safety. Thus, repeated trajectories, ecological memory, and systematic use of space emerged. When groups begin to move on a landscape scale, the environment ceases to be just habitat. It becomes organized territory. In an expanding ecosystem, even death became a driver of complexity. Carcasses fed entire chains of opportunists, decomposers, and secondary predators. Energy did not disappear, it circulated. The success of large animals created biological surpluses and new opportunities. The early Jurassic was crucial because it began to establish this relative abundance. And abundance, when sustained over millions of years, is the ideal fuel for gigantism. Not everything in the Jurassic was monumental stability. Local disturbances, floods, fallen trees, erosion, partial droughts, renewed patches of vegetation, and prevented the environment from freezing into a single configuration. This alternation between order and disruption favored diversity. Some animals explored newly opened areas. Others depended on dense forests. The result was a dynamic landscape capable of supporting many niches without losing the overall dominance of dinosaurs. When herbivores began to grow, vulnerability did not disappear. It merely shifted. Juveniles, isolated individuals, and weakened animals continued to be central targets. Therefore, social behavior, route choice, and position within the group mattered as much as size, tails, or body mass. The Jurassic taught a brutal lesson early on. Being large helps, but surviving also requires organization, vigilance, and constant reading of danger. In just a few tens of millions of years, the Earth began to display an increasingly recognizable Jurassic mosaic. Not a uniform landscape, but a set of ecosystems where dinosaurs already occupied the understory to the open plains, from riverbanks to coastal regions. The great transformation at the beginning of the Jurassic was this. Dominance ceased to be sporadic. It became geographic, systemic, and increasingly difficult to reverse. Long bodies and extended necks opened access to layers of vegetation that few rivals could explore in the same way. This reduced direct competition and allowed for the processing of immense volumes of plant material in continuous motion. There was no need to chew like modern mammals. It was enough to gather, swallow, and rely on an internal system capable of transforming plant abundance into tons of muscle, bone, and movement. Sauropod engineering was beginning to prove its superiority. The Jurassic world seemed lush, but it was never gentle. Floods, regional droughts, diseases, competition, and hunting kept constant pressure on all species. That is precisely why the success of the dinosaurs is so impressive. They did not thrive in an easy paradise. They flourished in an unstable system, geologically tumultuous and ecologically demanding. Their dominance was born not from luck, but from the ability to endure, adapt, and occupy on a large scale. When displacement routes repeat, space ceases to be explored randomly. It becomes known, memorized, and rediscovered. This predictability benefits herbivores, but also teaches predators. Throughout the early Jurassic, a planet of recurring paths, natural bottlenecks, and seasonal patterns began to emerge. In other words, a planet mature enough to support larger, more stable, and more ambitious ecological chains. The Triassic had forged the dinosaurs. The beginning of the Jurassic began to release them on a continental scale. It was not yet the peak of the Titans, but the rehearsal was already over. The planet now favored lineages capable of growing, migrating, transforming landscapes, and sustaining entire ecosystems through their own movements. What was emerging was not a curious fauna. It was a new architecture of biological power over the Earth. At the beginning of the Jurassic, dinosaurs stopped being merely talented survivors of a ruined world. They became the main engineers of the next world. Gigantism was still maturing. Large ecological empires were still organizing, and the most iconic forms would grow even more. But the direction was already irreversible. The Earth was finally beginning to take the shape of an era tailored to them.
Around 174 million years ago, the Jurassic was entering a more mature phase. The planet was still undergoing tectonic changes, but in many regions, the ecosystems already had enough breadth and stability to support gigantic communities. What was once initial expansion was now turning into consolidation. The Earth was no longer just allowing large dinosaurs. It was beginning to depend on their presence to maintain its own large-scale ecological balance.
In the Middle Jurassic, gigantism ceased to be a promise and began to become the norm in certain herbivorous lineages. Massive bodies, spines adapted to mass, long necks, and incessant consumption of vegetation allowed them to occupy large areas with impressive efficiency. These animals were no longer just large herbivores. They were organisms capable of transforming the landscape as they walked, creating corridors, compressing the soil, and redistributing organic matter over kilometers. The trails of these giants recorded something greater than simple movement. They revealed behavior, recurring routes, collective use of space, and a kind of biological geography superimposed on the physical terrain. Where a herd passed repeatedly, a system emerged. The Middle Jurassic was the phase in which this spatial order strengthened. The empires of the dinosaurs were not made of walls. They were made of paths, returns, vast territories, and ecological memory. Among the most emblematic herbivores of the era, the stegosaurs gave the Jurassic an unmistakable visual signature. Their compact bodies, dorsal plates, and armored tails were not mere cinematic adornments. They were part of an anatomy shaped by defense, possible thermoregulation, display, and survival in a world where growing did not eliminate risk. They proved that Jurassic dominance did not follow a single model. There were elongated colossi, yes, but also unique profiled walking fortresses. One of the hallmarks of the Middle Jurassic was the stratification of food. Vegetation could be exploited at different heights by very different bodies, reducing direct competition and allowing for large-scale coexistence. Some animals grazed on the ground in low vegetation, others harvested intermediate layers, and the longest necks reached the top of the canopy. It was as if the dinosaurs had vertically divided the forest among themselves. The Jurassic gigantism was not just about weight. It was intelligent body architecture. Different groups developed distinct ways to explore vegetation, distribute mass, and conserve energy. Some favored higher postures and feeding at height. Others relied on horizontal reach and constant movement. The result was an extraordinary functional diversity. The planet was not being dominated by a single repeated colossus. It was being conquered by multiple gigantic solutions. When the herbivorous base grows and becomes more complex, large carnivores find space to evolve in parallel. The Middle Jurassic saw the consolidation of larger, more specialized predators better suited to ecosystems with immense and abundant prey. It was no longer enough to capture small animals in quick opportunities. It was necessary to understand herds, isolate vulnerable individuals, explore terrain, and, above all, survive in a universe where the prey could crush the hunter. The Middle Jurassic was a school of collective defense and deterrent anatomy. In environments dominated by large herbivores, the predator no longer faced just a single target. It faced contexts, groups, open routes, unfavorable terrain, vigilance, and impressive bodily weapons. Survival increasingly depended on risk calculation. This intensified a silent evolutionary arms race. Herbivores and carnivores refined, generation after generation, the biological technologies of attack and response. Mature Jurassic ecosystems were systems of abundance, but also of cost. Giant bodies required water, constant food, and viable routes. In unstable soils, a wrong step could mean immobilization, injury, or death. This makes the success of these animals even more impressive. They did not dominate simple landscapes. They dominated varied and often hostile environments, calibrating weight, movement, and behavior so that their own greatness did not become a trap. The Middle Jurassic consolidated a central characteristic of large ecological empires: the repeated use of key regions. Certain valleys, riverbanks, and passages between forests functioned as the arteries of the dinosaur world. There, food, water, circulation, and risk concentrated. These flow zones were vital because they connected the individual scale to the continental scale. A successful route did not serve just one animal. It sustained entire lineages over many generations. The grandeur of the Jurassic did not negate the dependence on climate. Rainy seasons could transform the landscape into explosive abundance. Drier periods reorganized the map of survival and compressed populations around persistent water sources. Gigantism flourished where there was enough predictability, but never total security. Therefore, Jurassic ecosystems were both stable and tense, enormous, productive, and always vulnerable to sudden changes in the distribution of resources. As continental fragmentation progressed, coastlines and basins multiplied. New coastal outlines, new regional climates, and new opportunities for biological isolation emerged. Some populations began to evolve in more closed scenarios, while others evolved in broader corridors. The Middle Jurassic was not only the age of size. It was also the age of geographical differentiation. And when geography fragments, evolution gains new laboratories to test life forms. No ecological empire can sustain itself solely with monumental adults. The entire life cycle needs to function. In the case of sauropods, this meant crossing the most dangerous stretch of existence: youth. Small, vulnerable, and still far from the protective mass of adulthood, the young were prime targets. The success of these lineages, therefore, depended on numbers, growth rate, choice of safe areas, and the ability to survive the early years. The giants not only consumed vegetation, they also modified the way it was available to other species. By knocking down branches, opening clearings, and lowering certain areas, they created indirect food and new landscape structures. This cascading effect made the large herbivores true ecological engineers. The Middle Jurassic precisely marks this transition. Dinosaurs were not just dominant inhabitants. They were shaping forces of productivity and the circulation of living matter. Predators of a colossal world needed to be patient, opportunistic, and extremely economical. Investing energy in the wrong confrontation could be fatal. Therefore, the Great Jurassic Hunt revolved around calculation. Who is isolated? Who is sick? Which slope favors the attack? Where can't the group turn in time? The spectacle of nature, here, was brutal mathematics. Surviving meant mastering the logic of cost even before the moment of violence. At night, the Jurassic did not lose its grandeur. It changed its language. Giant forms partially disappeared in the twilight. Sounds gained importance, sense-guided movements, and the risk became more diffuse. Mature ecosystems are also recognized for this. They do not function only in full light. They continue to pulse in other frequencies. The dinosaurian dominance was total because it occupied space and time, from the midday glare to the most ambiguous hours of darkness. In many areas, the repeated use of land by huge animals created permanent marks on the structure of the environment. Deep trails, lowered vegetation, compacted areas, and recurring clearings became part of the ecosystem. This helped some organisms and harmed others. As is the case in any dominant biological order, the success of certain lineages rewrote the living conditions for all others. The Middle Jurassic was the phase in which this rewriting became visible. The stegosaurs as well represent an essential truth of the Jurassic. Not all power is expressed as maximum mass. Sometimes, evolutionary efficiency arises from a singular combination of defense, posture, food selection, and visual intimidation. In a world of larger prey and predators, dorsal plates and armed tails could mean the difference between being continuously pursued or being considered too expensive a target. Fear is also an ecological force. The apparent solidity of the Middle Jurassic did not eliminate episodes of disruption. Violent floods, landslides, localized fires, and seasonal droughts continued to test entire populations. But now the ecosystems were robust enough to absorb some of these shocks without completely collapsing. This resilience is a hallmark of large, mature systems. They do not avoid disturbance. They learn to survive it without losing the central structure of the domain. At the beginning of the Jurassic, the question was whether dinosaurs could occupy the planet. In the Middle Jurassic, the question changed. Now it was, how far can this model of dominance go? The answer began to emerge before our eyes. Larger herds, more diverse bodies, entire landscapes structured by their presence, and predators increasingly calibrated for this new world. The Earth no longer seemed merely inhabited by dinosaurs. It seemed built for them. The coexistence of multiple giants was only possible because the Middle Jurassic refined the ecological sharing of space. Different species occupied distinct food heights, different types of terrain, different schedules, or different routes. This reduced direct conflict and increased the collective efficiency of the system. Large biological empires do not sustain themselves through constant confusion. They sustain themselves through invisible organization. And the Jurassic had found this organization on a monumental scale. The more stable and predictable the system, the more sophisticated the hunt needs to become. Jurassic predators evolved not only muscles and teeth, but also timing, behavioral reading, and intelligent use of terrain. They were the selective pressure that prevented complacency. In a world of relative abundance, death remained present as a permanent filter. Perhaps that's why Jurassic ecosystems are so fascinating. They were rich without being gentle, grand without ever becoming safe. The Middle Jurassic was the phase in which the age of dinosaurs gained planetary density. It was no longer just about a few famous valleys or a succession of impressive forms. It was about an entire world coming into sync with its dominance. Water, vegetation, movement, hunting, defense, and reproduction began to operate on a scale that only these animals seemed capable of sustaining for long geological intervals. In the heart of the Jurassic, the dinosaurs were no longer conquering. They were ruling. There would still be growth, specialization, and new forms of gigantism. But the essential was settled. The most impressive terrestrial communities on the planet belonged to them. The overall balance of the era revolved around their bodies, their migrations, and their needs. The Jurassic Empire was established, and now it was preparing to reach the visual peak of its own greatness. The Middle Jurassic transformed growth into consolidated dominance. The planet was no longer rehearsing gigantism, it lived within it. The large herbivores shaped landscapes, the stegosauruses framed the horizon, the predators learned to measure the impossible, and the Earth itself seemed to be rhythmically marked by colossal strides. But the peak had not yet been fully revealed. The best, the most vast, and the most iconic of the Age of Titans was still about to take shape.
Around 161 million years ago, the Jurassic entered its upper phase. Now, the Age of Dinosaurs no longer needed to prove that it worked. It was displaying its peak. Large plains, extensive river systems, and mature ecosystems supported some of the most impressive landforms in the history of life. The world of Titans was no longer a promise or a construction. It was a consolidated reality, vast, powerful, and visually almost unbelievable.
Among the giants of the late Jurassic, some took the vertical exploration of food to an extraordinary degree. With their necks raised, long front limbs, and monumental trunks, they could reach parts of the canopy that few other herbivores could touch. It was not just greatness for the sake of greatness. It was large-scale specialization. In a planet already filled with immense herbivores, occupying another layer of vegetation meant securing space, food, and an advantage in a competition fought at the canopy level. Other giants followed a different strategy. Long bodies, lower necks, and constant movement allowed them to sweep vast areas of vegetation with impressive efficiency. Instead of dominating in height, they dominated in length. This contrast between gigantic models reveals the sophistication of the late Jurassic. The Age of Titans was not a repetition of identical colossi. It was a multiple experiment on an extreme scale, where different body architectures coexisted and thrived side by side. The crossing of rivers reveals better than almost any other scene what it meant to be a giant in the Jurassic. Each movement required balance, reading the current, protection for the young, and precise choice of the crossing point. The reward, however, was immense. Access to new feeding areas, escape from local scarcity, and connection between vast territories. Gigantism only works when it can remain mobile, and the largest sauropods of the Jurassic achieved exactly that. In the same world of long-limbed colossi, the stegosauruses continued to impose a different kind of presence. Less massive than the largest sauropods, but extremely striking, they embodied the idea of a shielded herbivore disciplined by natural selection. Their plates outlined the horizon of the late Jurassic, while the armored tails served as a reminder that even on a planet of giants, survival depended on making a predator's attack costly, difficult, and risky. If giant herbivores are the symbol of Jurassic abundance, the large theropods represent the cruel discipline that kept this world sharp. Among them, forms like the Allosaurus embody the peak of hunting in the late Jurassic. They were not invincible, nor did they attack indiscriminately. They were specialists in identifying opportunity, using terrain, pursuing weakness, and turning any misstep into a sentence. The empire of herbivores existed, but it was constantly tested. The top of the food chain was not occupied by a single type of carnivore. There was a variety of forms, sizes, and strategies, which made the late Jurassic even more tense. Some predators favored more open environments. Others benefited from edges, obstacles, and ambushes in uneven terrain. This diversity of selective pressure kept herbivores under constant watch. In any direction, the Titanic planet was also a planet of predatory calculations. The peak of the Jurassic was not a chaos of piled-up monsters. It was an impressive organization of space. Large sauropods dominated certain routes and bands of vegetation. Stegosaurs explored other levels and different patterns of risk. Predators patrolled predictable corridors. Each group occupied the environment distinctly. This invisible ordering is what allowed the system to function on such a scale without collapsing under absolute competition. Even in moments of renewal, the late Jurassic exposed the contrast between fragility and greatness. Hatchlings were born small in a world designed for monumental bodies, with seasonal droughts, sudden floods, and vigilant predators. The success of the great lineages depended on crossing this initial chasm between minimal size and titanic maturity. It is one of the most impressive aspects of the era. From discrete nests emerged the animals that, just a few years later, would reshape entire ecosystems. The youth of giants was probably a phase of relative speed, nervousness, and concentrated risk. Before carrying dozens of tons, it was necessary to survive with few defense resources beyond numbers, attention, and the indirect protection of adults. This gave predators a valuable window. The late Jurassic, therefore, was not just a duel between maximum monsters. It was also a silent war over who would manage to survive the early years. The most magnificent ecosystems of the Jurassic were also vulnerable to scarcity. During dry periods, immense herds were forced to converge on a few water points, making the space more congested, competitive, and dangerous. Grandeur, then, revealed its price. The larger the body, the greater the dependence on ecological stability, and the greater the concentration around a resource, the sharper the gaze of the great hunters became. When the rain returned, the planet reopened. Chutes exploded, valleys resumed movement, and ancient routes were taken up again. This alternation between restriction and expansion reinforced the need for mobility and ecological memory. The giant dinosaurs were not passive blocks of prehistoric flesh. They were navigators of seasonal landscapes, capable of synchronizing their fate with the pulse of water, vegetation, and distance. The image of the great Jurassic predator only gains full strength when we understand its limitations. An Allosaurus in front of healthy giants did not see just food. It saw risk, bones capable of crushing devastating tails, legs strong enough to kill with a single impact. Therefore, hunting was above all a decision. The most efficient predator was not the most aggressive. It was the one that knew how to retreat, wait, and choose the moment when the system finally provided an opening. Among the most famous weapons of the late Jurassic, the tail of the stegosaurus encapsulates the logic of defensive evolution. It didn't need to turn the herbivore into a hunter. It was enough to make the attack disadvantageous. In ecosystems where injuries could lead to a slow death, any prey that offered serious resistance changed the predator's calculations. The fear of a single successful response could protect an entire lineage over millions of years. The Upper Jurassic was not just made up of open horizons and colossal creatures in the open field. There were also deep forest corridors, wet margins, intricate deltas, and shaded areas where smaller or less massive animals found their own niches. This expanded the stability of the system. Large ecological empires only exist when the foundation is complex. And the Jurassic Foundation was rich enough to support everything from small consumers to the largest terrestrial titans of its time. The abundance of giants reverberated beyond them. Where there were large herbivores, there was nutrient displacement, occasional death on a massive scale, and opportunities for other forms of life to explore remains, margins, and moments of fragility. The late Jurassic, thus, was a system of ecological cascades. The greatness of a group sustained entire flows that traversed the sky, shallow water, soil, and the boundaries between life and decomposition. At night, the scale of the Jurassic became almost abstract. Colossal silhouettes moved in the twilight like shifting geographical features, while deep sounds traversed the dark. It was a world where the physical presence of the animals altered even the perception of space. The darkness did not erase the empire. It only made it more enigmatic. And perhaps that is exactly where part of the eternal fascination of this era lies, in the fact that it seems both real and mythical at the same time. In some environments, disturbances like fire and drought severely renewed the landscape. The late Jurassic was not an unchanging paradise. It was a living machine, capable of partially destroying itself to keep functioning. After local devastation, sprouts, new clearings, and other patterns of occupation emerged. Dinosaurs thrived because they did not depend on absolute stability. They thrived because they were able to keep up, on a large scale, with the violent renewal of the scenarios they inhabited. Few symbols summarize the Jurassic as well as a trail of giant footprints transforming the ground into new relief. Each step concentrated enough weight to alter microenvironments, redirect surface water, and create lasting marks. It is not an exaggeration to say that these animals, in certain contexts, functioned as a biological geomorphological force. The peak of the Jurassic was this: life on such a vast scale that the very boundary between organism and landscape began to blur. At its peak, the Jurassic revealed a Earth densely occupied by distinct and complementary herbivorous strategies. There were vertical, horizontal, armored bodies, fast in youth, slow in maturity, dependent on constant water, or more flexible in their movements. This diversity reinforces the true nature of the Age of Titans. It was not the victory of a single form. It was the consolidation of an entire system where many giant forms learned to coexist. In the late Jurassic, the great carnivore was less of a frenzied killer and more of a persistent strategist of the ecosystem. It tracked flows, recognized weaknesses, memorized patterns, and survived thanks to patience. This made it an inseparable part of the herbivore's empire. Such a grand system needed proportional filters. And the predators were exactly that: the mechanism that prevented excess weakness, careless dispersion, and complacency within a monumental world. Even at the height of its grandeur, the Jurassic was not stagnant. Continents continued to rearrange. basins deepened, seas advanced in certain regions, and new ecological frontiers emerged. The empire of the dinosaurs seemed absolute, but the stage continued to shift beneath their feet. This combination of biological stability and geological instability is what sets the stage for the transition to the next phase of Earth's history, more fragmented, more competitive, and even more unpredictable. The Jurassic peak was not just a moment of grand beauty, it was an evolutionary experience of maximum scale. Dinosaurs dominated routes, heights of vegetation, river systems, open zones, and forest edges with an almost unbelievable efficiency. But no peak lasts forever in natural history. The same planet that supported the Titans was beginning to prepare new pressures, new opportunities, and a deeper transformation in the order of terrestrial ecosystems. The late Jurassic represented the classic peak of the Age of Titans, the maturity of the great dinosaur empires, the visual dominance of the sauropods, the strength of the stegosaurs, and the lethal intelligence of great predators like the Allosaurus. But the planet would continue to change. Lands would continue to drift apart, lineages would specialize even further, and the colossal balance of the Jurassic would make way for a new escalation of competition, innovation, and power. The Jurassic was not the end of the great story of the dinosaurs. It was the moment when they transformed expansion into majesty and dominion into a visible empire. But the Earth never freezes at its peak. After the Titans would come even more fragmented worlds, even more specialized hunters, and new forms of supremacy in the Cretaceous. If you enjoy epic and well-crafted documentaries about prehistory, follow us, because this gigantic era is still far from saying its last word.